It has been popular for about 100 years now to be dismissive of the historicity or reliability or authenticity of the accounts about Jesus of Nazareth that we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the historical details we find scattered throughout the New Testament. And part of the argument has been, look, myths develop over time, and the Gospels were written late in the first century or early second century, some have even said, and it's a long time after these events happened. The people with whom it was revolving around, they were gone and died, and so, we just can't trust it. And now this has been a 100-year enterprise, the so-called search for the historical Jesus, the idea of getting to the man behind the myth, as it were, but it's really been amped up in the last 10 years or so with new books coming out, and it's a popular challenge on campus. And I just want to give you a couple real quick thoughts to hopefully undermine this notion. First of all, it trades to some degree on the idea that the Gospels were written late. But we have very, very good reason to believe that the Gospels were not written late, they were written early. I just want you to think of Luke, for example. Now, Luke was the physician who was the companion of Paul, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, and then wrote the companion story, which was the life of the early church in the book of Acts, of which he participates in a first-person way in many of the events there. Well, he ends the book of Acts fairly abruptly, and it's as if he comes to the present moment, to put it simply. It doesn't come to a nice close, a nice end. It tells a story, it wraps things up. It just stops. And it feels like, when you read it, that he is stopping because there's nothing more to write. He is finishing the book of Acts at the present moment, which is when Paul is in his first imprisonment. Now, this is early 60s. We know that Paul died in 64 to 65, right in that area, because that was the Neronian persecution that took his life. And if he died in 64 or 65, that means that Luke finished the book of Acts prior to that, probably in the early 60s. But the book of Acts comes after the Gospel of Luke. That means the Gospel of Luke, this account of Jesus' life that Luke wrote, had to come before the book of Acts. That means it came in the first part of the 6th century, or in the late, or the 6th decade, or the late 50s. But Luke wasn't the first Gospel to be written, by anybody's account. Mark was the first one. That means it had to come before. So what we have here is a very powerful argument that both Luke and Mark were written in the 50s, less than 30 years from the time of the events themselves. That's really tight. There's lots of eyewitnesses still around. And in fact, these accounts seem thick with eyewitness-type details. Not only that, the book of Romans and the book of Galatians are undisputed books written by Paul. Paul wrote them in the 50s, and both of them have a high Christology. In other words, both announce and declare and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, declared to be the Son of God, indeed, through the resurrection. That's in Romans chapter 1. In other words, in the second decade from Jesus' resurrection, within 2 decades, 2.5 decades, we have very, very high Christology. Listen, this is not enough time for myths to develop. Whether Jesus was the Messiah or not is maybe a separate issue, but the early church believed that. They believed in his resurrection. They believed that he was the Son of God. We have a record of that early on, and we have great historical accounts that are very, very close to the events themselves. And therefore, we have very, very good reason to trust them.